The following is a conversation with Brigadier General Robert Spalding, a former U.S. Air Force B-2 stealth bomber pilot, a China expert, the author of Stealth War and War Without Rules, and an entrepreneur building technologies to protect our connectivity and our personal data. You have written about Ray Dalio and his interests in China. He's been very outspoken about China perhaps as the next great superpower. On this show, Peter Zeihan has said to me very much the opposite, that China could be on the brink of catastrophe. What do you see ahead for China and their economy?
Well, I do see that they're running into difficulties, particularly after the coronavirus. Their manufacturing is probably not going to pick up to the level it once was. I think a lot of investors are starting to move their production outside of China. That being said, the Chinese Communist Party is pretty resourceful. They understand the challenges they face. Peter Zeihan talks about that they have a demographics issue. The Chinese know this. And in fact, I think they have a plan for it. I think the Belt and Road initiative is very much revolving around finding an opportunity for their excess male population to be to intermingle and intermarry with the populations of the nations, and as part of the Belt and Road initiative, seeing huge influx and investment in low value added manufacturing in Africa, and tens of thousands of Chinese have gone to these different manufacturing hubs that are on the Belt and Road initiative. Dalio talks about the ebb and flow in time, and the kind of like the Thucydides trap book that Graham Allison wrote. He surmises that China is going to surpass the United States. I think they have the option to, the ability to. Whether or not they will actually fulfill that, I think has a lot to do with their own ambitions, and how does that square with the rest of the world, and are they on board? I think one of the things that Russia's seen with its invasion of Ukraine is a pushback from the Europeans. I think the Chinese, very much want to take back Taiwan. I think they will take back Taiwan at some point. And then it's how is the rest of the world going to respond to that, and does that, fit into China's plans? Of course, they've used the Belt and Road Initiative as a means to create their own economic ecosystem. It's a pretty ambitious approach, and I think the jury is still out on whether or not they're going to be successful. But I don't subscribe to Zeihan's collapse view, and I certainly don't subscribe to Ray Dalio's, they're going to be the next superpower view. I think I subscribe to pieces of both, but I think we're going to have to see how China, the Chinese Communist Party, and the rest of the world kind of interact to see the outcome.
And you said something along the lines of, if their ambition is to surpass the U.S., you believe they have the option. Is there an alternative ambition? The narrative I seem to hear is that China wants to become the dominant force in the world.
Well, I think it's the approach that they take to achieve that. I think if they continue on the sort of the last 4 decades approach, which is to hide their capability and bide their time, not be too aggressive or antagonistic, I think that has been very successful for them. And they have the tendency to erode, any difference of opinion outside of China, as long as they're continuing to at least appear like they're playing by the rules. So, using corporations and financial institutions in the West to essentially be a proxy for what they're trying to do, I think has been very effective. To the extent that they are more aggressive, with their wolf warrior diplomacy, or territorially, militarily aggressive, I think that's going to actually backfire for them. I don't think it's going to necessarily see them be as successful as they have for the last 4 decades. So it really it really depends on, which way she goes. You could have seen or expected that after he consolidated power in this last party Congress, that maybe he was going to double down on being aggressive and on wolf warrior diplomacy. Actually, he's kind of backed away from that. When they had the protests over coronavirus, he's slowly kind of relaxed COVID restrictions. I think they're running into and realize they're running into economic difficulties, and the way that they've gotten out of that in the past is to engage the West in a more conciliatory fashion. So he's kind of been counter to, I think, what people expected him to do after the party Congress. That's what actually makes me nervous, because I think you could see the West essentially letting them continue to do what they've been doing because they see this less aggressive China as more palatable than the wolf warrior China.
And that makes you nervous. Why is that exactly?
Well, because their brand of authoritarianism is a brand that is increasingly being adopted around the world, not just in emerging market economies, but you saw with the coronavirus and the use of these very powerful tools that Silicon Valley has created, this idea of a world where widespread spying and censorship is just built into the overall business model. That is not good for democracies. That is how the Chinese Communist Party have modeled their system. So to the extent that they can leverage their relationships with the business community, with the financial community, to, in a sense, create a global narrative that supports this idea of, essentially IT-based authoritarianism, then you're going to see the Chinese model rise to the fore. And what that means is civil liberties, privacy, data sovereignty, things that in a digital sense, in a 21st century sense, are not the principles and values that the United States, or certainly after the United States, a lot of the democracies were based on.
Mm-hmm. This idea of IT-based authoritarianism, it's getting at a lot of the ideas in your newest book, War Without Rules. What does that title mean? How could you kind of sum that up for people?
War Without Rules is just an alternative interpretation or translation of the unrestricted warfare title. So you could say it's the translation of unrestricted warfare could also be translated as war without rules. So basically, using the fact that you don't obey any rules as a means of being effective in war is kind of the different translation. And really, this represents the Chinese Communist Party's doctrine. Excuse me. That that unrestricted warfare was based on.
Mm-hmm. So how do we see that play out?
If you look at standard trade policy or financial policy is a really good one, because every currency in the world is convertible. It's you can go to a bank and convert dollars into Deutschmarks, or it's not Deutschmarks anymore, now it's the EU, or the British pound, or the Japanese yen. You can't do that with the Chinese renminbi. In fact, the only institution in the world that can basically give you renminbi for another currency is the People's Bank of China. And the People's Bank of China is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So China has a non-convertible currency. So they have essentially a closed financial system. They're the only system in the world that's closed. And the fact that they're the second largest economy in the world and still allowed to have a closed financial system is quite odd. The other is, the World Trade Organization. They're a member of the World Trade Organization. But one of the stipulations to becoming a part of the World Trade Organization is that you have a free market economy. The Chinese have never had a free market economy, and they never aspired to have a free market economy. They say they do. So they are part of these systems, the monetary system. They're part of the trade system, and they subscribe, or at least say they're going to follow the rules. But in reality, their system is based on actually the opposite of breaking the rules at nearly every instance. So that's the idea of war without rules. You don't follow the rules. You say you're going to follow the rules, but you don't actually follow them.
So how do they pull this off then? If the rules are, to join the World Trade Organization, you have a free market economy, and they don't, how do they move around that?
Well, when you talk about international rules, there's no policeman. You have the Congress here in the United States to make the rules, and then you have the executive branch, which enforces the rules. Well, in the international sense, there's nobody really to enforce the rules. It depends on nations coming together and agreeing, and then actually abiding by the rules that they agree to. What unrestricted warfare talks about is this idea of the rules are in place to support the entrenched powers, which is essentially the liberal democratic countries, and that is not in the Chinese Communist Party's interest, and therefore the idea is to not abide by those rules that where the Chinese Communist Party had no part in agreeing that they should be the established rules. But they know they can't convince the liberal democratic countries to not to change the rules, because we created these rules to set up essentially an order that allowed for reduced conflict. World War II. Prior to World War II, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed this charter called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter really just kind of laid out these rules for the international order that would come after the end of World War II. Those rules, the Chinese Communist Party stipulate, aren't really in their interest. So why would they abide by them? And so, but they're not going to get the nations that have been successful using these rules and successful in working together to change them. So therefore, they have to find a different way to change them. And the way that they find to change them is to say, hey, we agree to the rules, but then as they become a part of these international institutions, they slowly use the same tools of politics that different political parties in different countries use to get the things they want. They create coalitions. So in the UN, for example, they create coalitions, and they use things like diplomacy, like the Belt and Road Initiative, to get the African nations where they have invested money to vote on their side. So, for example, we have a UN Human Rights Commission. And so they go on the UN Human Rights Commission, even though they obviously violate human rights. But because they have all of these other nations that are supporting them because they have given them money, then they're able to do it. The other way is to also make sure that their people are there working in these international institutions. So World Health Organization, TEDROS, was supported by the Chinese Communist Party. Then there's also permanent party workers at the UN. And it's the same goes on and on for all of these international institutions. By the way, this is all documented in Unrestricted Warfare. They talk about the need to basically slowly begin to change institutions away from their charter into more in a way that supports the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. So human rights, civil liberties, rule of law, free trade, these are all things that are counter to an authoritarian system. So China wants to erode those things as the rules of the road, if you will, and start using other rules and using this influence both on the body, so the nations that are members of these international institutions, and the people that work in these international institutions. So slowly, you begin to see the character of the institutions themselves have changed, and the principles and values that they truly support are not the ones that they were founded upon. So, it happens all the time domestically in governments. You see the changing nature of a country, but they just took that same idea and applied it to the international order.
It's interesting that these ideas are out in the open in this document, Unrestricted Warfare. How did that document come about, maybe for those who aren't familiar? And then how is it that while this is out in the open, it seems to continue?
Well, these two PLA Air Force lieutenant colonels. This was about the time that Clinton sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Strait in order to warn the Chinese Communist Party from, they were lobbing missiles essentially at Taiwan. It was about this time that these 2 PLA Air Force lieutenant colonels were doing an analysis of the power balance, military power balance between the China and the West, and particularly the United States. And so they within this book they analyzed the Gulf War, which was kind of, it essentially indicated the military power and prowess of the West, through the technologies that the United States applied in that war. In the course of analyzing that, they also started to look at the areas where China was being quite successful, and what they found, and what we have in the West, is called doctrine. What they found is there's a different type of military doctrine that could be revealed if you look not at the military lessons of the Gulf War, but look at the lessons of globalization and the internet that were beginning to avail themselves of the Chinese Communist Party and the advantages that could accrue. And so they wrote this Unrestricted Warfare in 1997. It was found and translated by the open source people at the CIA, and I read it in 1999. It was kind of an odd mixture of politics and economics and also warfare, and really didn't make a lot of sense to me. But when you think of it in the context of certainly going from 1999, where we were with the internet and where globalization was, to 2017, and you read it, and as I did, I read it again later on, you really start to get the sense, well, they were on to something. They were on to the fact that, the internet was going to provide this ability to influence populations beyond your borders. That globalization was going to give you the ability to have technology and talent and capital flow across borders, and that these two things could be used to China's advantage in terms of, essentially creating a different type of doctrine for warfare, for being successful in war, and applying that in this globalized, internet-connected context.
Mm-hmm. And so, with this out in the open, how is it that with so many smart people out there looking at this, that it still continues to happen?
Well, I mean, there's two reasons. One, it was obviously a willingness on the part of the United States and the free world to engage China in a way that would prevent, a global war like World War II or like the Cold War. And so there was a belief that as China was brought in, voluntarily brought in to the liberal democratic order, that they would as they gained in wealth and as they saw how beneficial it was to them that they became a part of this order, that they would slowly begin to change. And so their need to suppress, speech and this need for tyranny would slowly be suppressed and eventually would give way to democracy. Taiwan, when the Nationalist Party fled after losing the Civil War in China to Taiwan, they were an authoritarian system, and then eventually over time they became a democracy. The idea was that would be the same thing that would happen to China. They would get wealthy and then they would become more free. Of course, that didn't happen. Well, along the way, a lot of people in the West were getting rich on this idea of China would be, as they got richer, they would be more free. But in reality, what unrestricted warfare lays out is the way that you can become wealthy, but still maintain your authoritarian roots. Basically, how do you get the technology, talent, and capital of the West without having any of that ideology transfer? Document number 9, which comes out in 2013, again, another internal Communist Party document that was translated after it was leaked, talks about free speech as a myth. It's option by the West to destroy the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, it has to be countered at every turn. And the same with human rights and civil liberties. These are all just a manifestation of the dominance of the West, and in fact, the only purpose of that is to make sure that China doesn't have an opportunity to join the ranks of the wealthy nations, and so you have to basically stop these. But because you have corporations and you have financial institutions that want to do business in China, want to invest with China, or want to have China invest in them, then you have this other constituency. So you have the kind of the diplomats and the military types that think that this idea of bringing China into the system is going to prevent war, and then you have the business types and the financial types that say, oh, we're going to make money, we're going to get rich. Well, once and this is certainly the case when I was at the White House, once the folks that are in kind of the security space or the foreign policy space start to realize, okay, this is a very bad deal for us. Now they've got all these business and financial folks that they have to contend with, who are not happy about having their rice bowl disrupted. And so, when you look at the world today, when you look at the world prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, prior to the end of the Cold War, business was restrained. It was required to operate in a certain set of with a certain set of constraints, particularly as it involved the Soviet Union. There wasn't just you could go out and do business with the Soviet Union. You could do business, but it had to be under very, very strict circumstances. Well, after the end of the Cold War, there was this belief that that was no longer needed. So all those restrictions kind of faded away, and business got used to just doing whatever they want. And so the Chinese Communist Party then uses the fact that these businesses are not Chinese businesses. They're American, they're European businesses. And so therefore they have the ability to influence their own domestic political systems, the policies that their systems create. And so they do. And so when the Chinese Communist Party wants to influence the American political system or the European political system, they don't have to go and do it directly. They just have to incentivize the corporations and the financial institutions of the West, and they'll do it for them. And so, this is the reason it's been perpetuated, and this is a reason why you see, very timid policy steps being taken by the West in order to fix this, because people used to have corporations, you still have financial institutions making billions of dollars from this relationship.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like at the start, it must have been an incredibly seductive logic that you can get rich and that you can promote democracy in the world. I wonder now to influence people in business and finance to turn. What is the story now that people need to hear that could kind of bring them out of that?
Well, I mean, it hasn't been entirely good for free societies. In fact, look at the United States just as one example. In order to build China's industrial base, you had to destroy or dismantle America's. There was this belief that you could do that. You could do that without disrupting America's society. You think on the surface that, we've got, millions of people working in manufacturing, and for each person that works in a manufacturing job, there's probably like 4 communities that support that job because they're providing other services in the community. And so you have this whole ecosystem around manufacturing. And then there was this belief that you could basically replace those manufacturing jobs with, other, more high-skilled jobs like software programmers. So you're going to get rid of all these manufacturing jobs, and it's going to be great for these people that are in manufacturing because then they're going to have all of these high-paying software development jobs. Well, when you look at the actual numbers, and there's a good David Autor's done a lot of labor studies on this. He's a labor economist. Empirical studies on what was the impact of this movement of productivity from the United States to China, and what you see is just destroyed communities. I mean, flat out, communities that have just been flat out decimated. Not only have they lost, this vast, the support system that really kept those communities alive, but then what came into them were drugs, and then today you see a lot of fentanyl that's coming from China. So you have kind of a double whammy for these communities. You have people dying from fentanyl, and they no longer have really the support system that they had. So this problem is not just a problem of moving productivity and raising 600 million people out of poverty like the Chinese Communist Party claims. It's also the slow erosion of the American dream in America, and it also leads to a sense of malaise in the country, a sense that living attractive as it once was. And in fact, the Chinese Communist Party has done a good job of convincing particularly emerging market economies that their model is better. And you think about the Marshall Plan, which is one program that the United States used to foster this idea of a liberal democratic order. It came along with economic opportunity. The United States had the industrial base post-World War II, and they leveraged that industrial base to build Europe's industrial base back up. But when they did that, they also, focused on building civil institutions that would promote this ideal of, rule of law and human rights. Well, in much the same way, I think the Chinese Communist Party studied that. They learned from it. They recognized that the Soviet Union was not successful in opposing that model. And in fact, a better model would be to figure out how to take those benefits from a free system and apply it to the more authoritarian model without necessarily giving up that authoritarian system. And that's essentially what they've been able to do. And, consequently, it is slowly, and particularly this was the case during the coronavirus, how many countries came out and said, wow, if we could just be more like China, then we could, fight this coronavirus better. And you think about the implications for the free world when you talk about that, and you recognize that they have been very successful in convincing everybody that their model is actually better than democracy.
What do you think makes that convincing when we see this virus come out of China, and then it seems they're still struggling with vaccines and things like that? What is it that makes this "let's be like China" story so attractive?
Well, because I think the way it's portrayed, when you talk, so there's been enormous consolidation of economic power in the West. Only, five major organizations own most of the mainstream media today. Those organizations have, their major investors are like BlackRock. So you have consolidation of economic power in such a way that there is this tendency to have a narrative that is the prevailing narrative. And then then there's no dissent coming from any of those spaces, because think about it. For example, Thomson Reuters shares a board member with Pfizer. So, if you have a dissent coming out of, anything, any of the policies that are going on, you're not going to see that prevail in the mainstream media or in the corporate sector. And so you have an alignment of interest now amongst the media, which is supposed to be the so-called fourth estate in the free world. So if you do have things like, we've had in the United States before, economic consolidation, the Gilded Age is a good example, robber barons. We had a Secretary of the Treasury that was a secretary for 10 years and used the Treasury as his own piggy bank. The way that it was thought, at least in the United States, that you overcame those things was through the fourth estate. But now the fourth estate has been eroded as an effective institution at bringing to light these structural problems in our system. And oh, by the way, here's this number 2 economy in the world that just so happens that if we are consistent in a narrative in such a way that says that dissent is not allowed, and if you dissent, you will be essentially you will not have a voice. Well, then that and all those institutions are all related in terms of their economic and financial relationships. Now you have this coalescing of a system that allows for this narrative to be pervasive. And I mean, you look at it. We just recently had in the United States the Republican Party goes in and they can't get a speaker elected, for several days, and then the narrative is, well, this is really not. This is showing how democracy doesn't work, and yet here's one of the most democratic things that that's what it's this idea that we disagree, and then there's a process for coming to agreement, rather than just this is the way we're going to do it. And the fact that people can say that with a straight face and then accept it, then you realize that they are the Chinese Communist Party, and it's not just them entirely. It is in many ways it's us, in that we have lost sight of our own principles and values, and I think this is I think happens in any in the history of any nation. They have periods where they hew closer to their ideals, and there are periods where they kind of go away from their ideals. And I think certainly you see that in the United States today. There's much more consolidation of economic power. There's much more willingness to have the corporations and the media and the government aligned, and in a way that says that we have a prevailing narrative. You have to get on the narrative. If you're not on the narrative, you're out. And so this is exactly what the model in China. And so when you start to look at this, and this this is not how my time began analyzing China. It wasn't until I started to see parallels between the two that I really became concerned, because if the United States doesn't stand as a bulwark, yet instead slowly becomes consumed by it, then, it doesn't matter if it's in what form. It doesn't matter, that you have a single party, organization in China that creates the authoritarian system, or that you have this kind of corporation-led authoritarianism that's also IT based. So you just look at the recent revelations of the dialogue between the FBI and Twitter in terms of who should be saying what on the Twitter platform, in the guise or in under the auspices of misinformation or disinformation. You can take all the names away. You can basically take the names away and just say this happened. And if we didn't know any better, you would swear that this was going on in China. And then reveal, pull back the curtain and say, no, here's the names of the organizations. But it comes out, and people are like, this, it's nothing. It doesn't really mean anything. It means everything. It's basically violating the very tenets of who we are as a nation, and I don't see a lot of outrage about it. So you have to wonder, I think getting back to your original question about Ray Dalio and Peter Zeihan, you have to wonder, does the United States deserve to exist, and at least in the form that it was conceived of, and if the population is not educated and engaged enough to recognize the slow descent into authoritarianism, then you have to wonder, what's going to come next? What's going to be the prevailing form of governance that arises when the United States is no longer there to say, hey, this is the way it should be.
So when citizens look and they see this consolidation of power with organizations, there's this distrust in large organizations, questions of the media, so many things, it can start to seem like this creeping authoritarianism is where we're headed, and that maybe there's no hope. Is there a set of actions that individuals can be taking to better set themselves up?
Well, just look at the dialogue we're having here. I think we're not on, Fox News, we're not on CNN. What I've seen is this kind of creeping rise of, slow rise of journalism that, unfortunately, the mainstream media doesn't, acknowledges journalism. You have the guys doing what are the guys that do the undercover videos? Trying to think of the name, but it's people going out and just exposing the things that are happening. The best thing for corruption is transparency. And when when we're confronted with these things happening, being put in their face, oftentimes the reaction is, well, I don't want to see that, or, we shouldn't be showing that. But in reality, that's the whole point of the fourth estate. So what you can do is you can become educated and you can become engaged, and then you can, there are folks, that can begin to shed light on the things as they are, and I think that's the only way. And to the extent that in our society the judicial system defends those things, which sometimes they haven't been prone to do in recent times, but as long as the judicial system defends this right to free speech and this this right to assemble and this right to dissent, then I think we're gonna have an opportunity to come out of it. But that type of journalism, the willingness to put yourself at risk and talk about the things that nobody wants to talk about, I think we've those aren't the things that we celebrate. Who do we celebrate now? We celebrate social media influencers, and we celebrate people that are wealthy, but we don't necessarily celebrate those that are taking personal risks to reveal things that are corrupt, and that should be revealed. And I think that's one of the things that I think people can do is to just be educated, be engaged, and then get out there and expose what's going on. Because the more you expose it, the more people become educated and then can become engaged in the political process, in the education system, in their own communities. They can do things and they can say things and they can expose things that really starts to get people thinking, and then you use the system that the Constitution was created for. Use that in ways that start to break apart these challenges we face.
And what has that journey been like for you, going from being a relatively private military officer to being now someone who's more outspoken? You're in the media, you're writing books. What's that journey been like?
Well, I had a Twitter account, but I didn't tweet until my first real significant tweet was the day after I retired, and so I retired because I recognized that the best thing that I could do was be a voice for the things that I'd learned, the things that I'd seen. I'd studied war, I'd fought in wars, I had prepared for them, and I recognized that there was a different type of war happening, and that this war I was ill prepared for, and in fact could not engage on that battlefield as a member of the uniformed services. And so, in a sense, I took my oath to the Constitution and said, okay, if I'm really going to be able to fulfill my oath to the Constitution, I can't do it in uniform, because that battlefield has rules, and the battlefield that the United States is losing its soul to has no rules, and it's everywhere, and it's 24/7, and we're having a hard time surviving it. And so I just felt like if I could get out in the private sector and then be a voice for the things that I have learned, the things that I have seen, and shedding light on it, at least then people could then take that and run with it in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm. And then it's interesting that part of that mission for you is your calling as an entrepreneur, and that you were kind of ironically trained in business in China. What has the journey into entrepreneurship after the military been like?
Well, when I was at the White House, I wrote this paper on 5G. It caused a little bit of a stir, but it was never supposed to see the light of day. And in fact, it was meant just as an informational paper and presentation to different leaders in the government about the opportunities and challenges of 5G. And one of the things that I recognize and what you see in unrestricted warfare is this use of personal data, personal citizen data, by authoritarians or those that can consolidate that data, that it can be used to create outcomes for the Chinese Communist Party that are counter to the owners or the. And this is what Silicon Valley had created, and this is what the Chinese Communist Party identified. Hey, we can create these things like social credit scores, and we can begin to monitor the population and have the population, kind of self-correct, to be the kind of citizen we want them to be, just by monitoring them scores and then giving them, bonus points for doing good, and cutting back access to services for being bad. And I said, okay, well, if thinking of that system, taking the systemic approach to it. If your data can be used against you to influence your life in ways that are counter to your interests, then, wouldn't it be important for you to be able to secure your data in a way that somebody couldn't do that? So I started thinking about it, and there was this technology called 5G, and I said, okay, well, if you can take the technology, if we're going to do a refresh, if we're going from kind of, say, the internet as it is today to this new internet, is there a possibility that we could change the way that we looked at data in that new infrastructure that supported that technology, that internet? And so, that was what my paper was about. And so I began to work in that technology, and I had the project within DoD that was about protecting 5G networks. And then I just realized that if I really wanted to go after this idea of an internet that protected democracy, and by protecting democracy I mean protected data, because digital data was your data was fundamental to your freedom, that I would have to do that in the private sector. And so I asked the Air Force leadership to let me retire, and did, and then 4 years ago started a company that focused on resilient and secure infrastructure to support and protect the most precious resource, which is data. Along the lines, I've got the scars now of an entrepreneur. It's difficult, you're every single day. You have to get up with the drive and the energy to see a vision come to life, and there are so many bumps along the way. But you have to be resilient. You have to be focused, and you have to, have a vision. And you have to have the courage of your convictions. You have to be able to, accept the good with the bad. But by and large, it's I wouldn't trade it for anything. I love what I'm doing. It's even though it's hard, even though it's difficult. I get to work with great people who, share the vision of a secure and resilient internet. And so, we've been working hard for 4 years to develop our products, and we're just ready to go to market in 2023. So, I think the best is yet to come. It also just happens that the Russians thankfully invaded Ukraine. I say thankfully, obviously tongue in cheek. It's terrible, but I knew this was coming, and I also know that China is bound to invade Taiwan. The world is kind of reverting to its natural state of conflict, and this importance of your digital life being in a secure and resilient infrastructure, I think is becoming more and more. People understand the need for it. When you have substations being shot, when you have AT&T buildings being bombed, when you have hurricanes. When you have all of these different threats that are happening to our infrastructure every single day, I think people are starting to recognize, okay, we need to do something about this. And now we have products that are designed to do that.
As far as people recognizing that, one of our listeners has a question along those lines. He goes by Jim, and he asks, how do we go about creating a firewall to protect ourselves from bad actors who wish to divide our society? Perhaps maybe that compares with the technology that you're talking about?
Well, yeah. I mean, the way we envisioned, so the way infrastructure is built today is it's highly centralized, and it kind of grew up organically. So we have just a very few large data centers that run, most of the cloud. These are connected to telecommunications networks that are also highly centralized. And I mentioned the AT&T office. It was a switching office in Nashville that was blown up by this guy that was a contractor, worked for AT&T, put explosive in an RV and parked it outside the building, then blew it up. So you had perfectly functioning cell towers in Tennessee that couldn't work because they couldn't communicate with the brains of the network. So it's a highly centralized network both on the telecommunications side and the cloud computing side. So just losing an Amazon data center, a single Amazon data center, can have enormous consequences for how our systems work. And then you look within that, you have, say, water systems and power systems and communication systems that all rely on this infrastructure to be functioning, and then somebody hacks it, or somebody shoots it, or somebody runs into it, or it gets taken down through a storm or through a hurricane or what have you. And then you have the breakdown of services and the breakdown of civil society. And so what 5G created was this idea that infrastructure that supported these telecommunications networks now were increasingly going into software. And so instead of being highly centralized, you could take all of that software, combine it into individual nodes, and make those decentralized. And so instead of having one data center, you could have thousands of data centers. Instead of having one core for your network, like in that AT&T instance, you could have thousands of cores. And so by creating this decentralized architecture, you could create this decentralized architecture that worked with the existing centralized architecture to create areas of resiliency. So not every location would have connectivity and this ability to run your apps, but certain ones could. And you could say, in a community, these are the areas that I want to make sure that if the power goes out or anything happens, I have the ability to keep things going, whether it's water or, whether it's, downtown where, you can continue to have transactions. Each community is different. And then you could start to build these things in ways that, say everything does go down, you still have these pockets where you can go and have access to emergency services, access to medical services, the ability to do transactions, the ability to keep water systems running, or if the grid goes down, the ability to bring the grid back up because you have this existing network that allows you to because when a grid is coming up, you have to balance the loads. Today, that's done in software on networks. If those networks are powered by that and they don't remain powered, then you have a problem bringing those grids back up. So having these systems available allows you to restore modernity much faster, and even if modernity's gone, allows you to still have connectivity so that you can get the services and the help that you need. If you look in these situations that happen, there's a good book, 1 Second After. Most of the traumatic effect to the population comes to do because you can't get services. You don't know what's going on. People are confused. They're scared. They're frightened. There's no way to get the messages because if the cellular network goes down, how are you going to find out what to do? How are you going to find out when the power is coming back on? Is the power coming back on? If the power is not coming back on, what do you do? How do you? And then think about it. 100 years ago, this wouldn't be a problem. People knew how to live. Today, people don't know how to live. They have their phone. Their phone, gets some places. You buy stuff with it. You communicate. That connectivity goes away. What do you do? And these things happen every day. They happen on a kind of a micro scale. Some people lose power. Some people lose, their network connection. But when you're talking about societal, the ability for, say, like an EMP, a high altitude EMP burst to take out the grid, how do you keep the society from collapsing, like happened during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans? And so, it's creating this pockets of resiliency around the country, and doing it in a way that's cost effective, so that if you have a choice between, okay, I'm going to do my infrastructure the old-fashioned way, or I'm going to have this more resilient one, then it shouldn't be cost, right? So you should have the option to say, hey, I want to do more resilient. It's not going to cost me more. And that's kind of the idea.
Mm-hmm. This seems such a crucial issue, too. I talk to a lot of folks who are thriller novelists, who are often veterans, too, and they'll say, eventually at some point their plots often hit, well, if the grid goes down, it's chaos. And that's reality, so it plays nicely into their writing. So to have some sort of defense against that seems so crucial.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's you see in these dystopian movies and books all the time the collapse of civilization, and it's this is not having used to be electricity. I think less so electricity now. I mean, even if you think about just the Cold War, people had radios. There were air raid sirens. There was this whole entire infrastructure that was designed to alert the population in the event of, in that case, nuclear war. All of that's been dismantled, yet a lot of that thinking still remains. Like there was a public service announcement in New York saying, "Hey, if we have a nuclear attack, go to your home and await further instructions." And people were like, "How am I going to get further instructions? What means are you going to use to give me my further instructions?" And this is the problem. The systems that we created back then no longer function. And even if they did, it would require people to have that equipment. They don't. It would require them to, if they had that equipment, to know how to use it. They don't. And so, what do they know? They know they get Amber Alerts on their phone. They don't know how. They know that one pops up. So now they're going to go home and they're going to sit there in their phone, and their phone's not going to work because it's not connected to anything or a system that allows you to really leverage that. And so, recognizing that, and then recognizing that that's a big problem is really what, I set out to do, when I left the military.
Mm-hmm. Well, General Spalding, before I ask my last question, for folks who want to follow along with you on that journey and learn more about what you're up to, where can they look for you online?
I'm on Twitter at Robert_Spalding, no U in Spalding. Website, generalspalding.com. If you want to take a look at our company website, it's SEMPRE.ai. That's SEMPRE. That stands for Secure EMP Resistant Edge.ai. And I'm out there every single day on Twitter, talking about the things that I see that are wrong, either in our own country or with our relationship with China. I've written 2 books, Stealth War and War Without Rules. They're both available on Amazon. Stealth War sold, over 70,000 copies and been printed in many different languages. So War Without Rules, not as many sold. Of course, it's only been out less than a year, but it has been translated into a few different languages as well. So, but thank you.
Yes, and I've read them both, and I'll put links to those and all the other things you mentioned in the description for people to check out. And General Spalding, my final question is, I see that maybe it looks like you have a smartwatch on, that you've got your television behind you, so you haven't shut yourself off. I'm wondering, what do you think people can do to protect themselves as individuals?
Well, yeah, you're right. I haven't shut myself off. I do believe in multi-factor authentication. I'm a strong believer in encryption. I believe encryption is a fundamental human right. Unfortunately, we live in a system of open data, and until we have an alternative to that, which I believe in some ways that SEMPRE will provide that alternative to some. It really doesn't make a lot of sense for me to live off the grid, if you will. It's inconvenient, and it is. There's really no real good alternative to it, as today, as we speak. So that being said, I think that it's important that we continue to strive for that kind of ideal where you can live a connected life, but not have to worry about your privacy being used against you. And I think so. I've kind of said, All right, I've got to accept that this is the world as it is today. I'm gonna live in the world. By the way, I did the same thing when I was in China. I had all the apps, the Chinese apps. I knew how to use them. I knew how to go around, use my phone to buy things. Um, it is what it is. But I think having understanding that that how your data can be used against you, I think, is one part of the solution. And the other part is when we at the time that we understand as a nation and as an international community that data is a fundamental, privacy of that data sovereignty is a fundamental human right. Until we, essentially create standards that require that infrastructure be built that supports that ideal, we're going to have a less than optimum world. And the best you can do is to be smart, to be educated, to understand that these things are going on, and then to do the things that you can, as much as you can, to protect your data.
If you enjoyed this, you'll probably enjoy my discussion with Peter Zeihan, where we discuss the geopolitics of China, with Michael Beckley, where we discuss China's military, and with Denny McMahon, where we discuss China's economy. Links to those are available in the description.